I think it's really important that you take the time to step back and look at the individuals and the opportunities, because it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day running of the business and what's urgent today, and letting the urgent block out the important. And I would say your people development is incredibly important, but it's not always the most urgent thing on your mind today. So this urgency versus importance is something that good leaders can do. They can split out this thinking about I've got to get this business or this client today, but how do we make sure we're balancing that with the long-term future and health of our organization?
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, a podcast for C-suites and tech decision makers to find tools and patterns from the different peers. And I'm so excited today to be speaking to Melanie Hughes, who's been in HR and head of HR for 20 years, from startups to Fortune 500 companies, with a breadth of experiences. She's an advisor to many amazing organizations. I'm so happy to be working with her at Mattermost and to have her for a conversation today. Melanie, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm happy to be talking to you.
Yeah, so I learned so much from talking to you all the time about hey, we're all sort of building these companies and we're shaping culture, and how do we sort of transform the way that we work, as we go from sort of change to change in the macro. So, I was at a conference the other day about national security and defense, and the world right now today is April 11th when we're recording this, and the world is changing, and there's this mentality of defense that was about, okay, we go slow. We don't make a mistake. We focus on that sort of world, and things are changing. Say we have to up the tempo. We have to balance risk and outcomes. So there's sort of a cultural transformation happening in a number of defense organizations. There's a move to sort of how do we work and be more independent and sovereign if we have to? How do we think about different risks? And there's cultural transformations happening in the public sector, in the private sector, as you deal with all the different changes in international policy. So when you think about maybe to start off, when you think about culture, and you think about how do you shape culture and what are the levers, how would you sort of think about that at the high level, the HR leadership, at the CEO, at the board level?
Yeah. It's a great question, Ian. And I think one of the things that's really important about culture is it's got to be managed. And it comes from the top. It comes from the CEO. And the culture needs to be supportive of what the business strategy is. So to your point, if you're moving from a risk-averse, a very slow-moving culture to being one that, really speed is important, then you've got to think about all of the levers that you pull in order to change that culture, because people are not going to change overnight. And so it starts off with, what do you value as an organization? What are your values as a CEO? And with those values, you can talk about them and make them kind of very explicit in writing, etc. But that's really not going to change people's behavior. So firstly, you've got to think about exactly what you want those values to be. Then you've got to think about, how am I going to express those, and really get input from people around the organization who've got the right way of thinking in order to get the company to its hoped for future culture, and form these values, and then think about what can you do within the organization to reinforce those. And then it kind of goes down to what your competencies are. How do you recruit for people? What are you looking for? There was a famous example when I was first starting off my career, and the organization was valuing people with innovation because they wanted people to be innovative. They thought that was the right thing to do. And so they recruited all of these people with innovation skills, and they put them into jobs where they wanted to follow directions. And as a result of that, they ended up with a lot of dissatisfied people who didn't fit the culture and who left. And so figuring out what your cultural need is and aligning your recruiting behavior around that is incredibly important. So recruiting is one area. Another one is your measurement. So how do you measure success? And most people's performance management have some elements of results and some elements of how you get there. And the how you get there needs to really reinforce this culture that you're trying to evolve to. And recognition. Who do you call out at a town hall? Who do you promote? And are those the values that you're trying to instill in people? Um, and of course, people respond to financial rewards as well. Most people respond to financial rewards. So, are those financial rewards uh, being reinforcing this hopeful culture that you're working towards? So, there's all of these different levers and ways of reinforcing that view. But at the end of the day, some people will get there and some people won't. You can only do so much to outline the culture and reinforce it and bring people along with you.
Yeah, and how do you I think that totally resonates, and I think you have folks that are, really amazing for certain types of in the early stage environment, they're owning 10 different things,
Mhm.
and as you grow, you have to narrow and you have to get, you have to do one of 2 things. Either you sort of level up and build an organization or really get really good at some things. I think
Mhm.
there's a paper called "Letting Go of Your Legos," that's one of the startup funds was really talking about, which is, well, if you're going to grow and you have people that are going to be excellent, they have to be comfortable with like reducing scope and getting better and becoming specialists. So there's a transformation in the organization, but there's a transformation for individuals. How do you think about approaching that at different levels? That how do you take people who are really great and just keep them growing, as the needs of the business change?
Um, Again, a very good question. So there are some people that will automatically look to grow and do different things, and it's in their DNA. So they love the challenge of figuring out how do I do things differently as the organization grows. Um, and some people will have to get these more specialist roles and reduce in scope. And so there's an ego component to this too, which is, are they prepared to give up that big title with that big scope to become a specialist in something and get better and deeper knowledge in that one area in order to stay with the company and evolve with its needs? But I found in, several of the startups that I've worked in, there are some people that are serial startup people and they like that early phase and they like that job and they just move from one startup at that phase to the next startup to the next startup. Um, and that's what they're good at and that's what they love to do. Um, but, I think there are a lot of people who want to grow with an organization, and we incentivize people by giving them, ownership of the company, some equity to stay and grow with it. And so, it's a lot of it is about good leadership and management as well, of explaining to these people, you're not less valuable because you're doing a smaller scope of work. In fact, you're very valuable because you've got the history of the organization. We just need you to do something different. And what skills, how can we help you grow into this new role? What can we do to support you as you move into this perhaps more specialist role? Um, and the other um, thing that we see a lot in these kinds of growth companies is lateral promotions, and growing sideways, growing horizontally, um, and broadening your skill set. And people with a curious mindset really enjoy that. Um, and as they grow horizontally, they then become sometimes uniquely qualified for new roles that occur in the future because they've gathered an array of different knowledge, and as new opportunities come up, they're the ones best positions with knowledge of the organization and knowledge of the different business or products.
Yeah, I totally love that. That kind of the thought of what some people call a multi-tool player, right? So they can do this and they can do that piece, and there's people that are really hungry
Exactly.
for that.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it really does prepare you. I remember I used to be at Microsoft, and they would
Yeah.
have people that they would like force to go like from engineering to
Yes.
like running part of the go to market and just moving around so that they're
Mhm.
ready to be an executive and they have experiences and credibility across all those different places.
Yeah. I think also, Ian, when you look at when you're preparing people for a CEO role, for example, it's a very purposeful set of movements and development across different parts of the organization in order to get to that role. And so you're effectively just doing the same thing lower down in the organization, which is gain all of these different skill sets, and then you're qualified for this next role. You've learned how to manage people, you've learned how to manage strategy, you've learned how to manage finance, um, and now you can manage this business. And so gathering those skill sets can make you uniquely qualified for the next job.
Yeah, I totally see that, and especially across the organization, you're going to have stars. You're going to have people that have really
Yes.
proven they're voracious. They'll move horizontal, like no job too high, no job too low. They can speak the truth to power. They can be in executive meetings. Um,
Yes.
And, each of them has sort of like development areas. And like, how'd you think about like, okay, you've got sort of like these people who are kind of really extraordinary, but they're sort of all across the organization. They're not ready to be executives or top level, but
Mm,
we want to put them in positions of influence and leadership.
mhm,
And, do you think about that as sort of a little more bespoke on the situation? Do you think about that
mm.
as a functional, on the function you want to lift people up? Do you think it cross-function across the company? Like, what are best ways to sort of like uncover these stars and sort of like, just unlock that potential?
Mhm. Well, a good succession planning process and an identifier of high potentials is really important in organizations because it's not just about identifying those people; it's about understanding where they want to go and what the opportunities are in the organization for them to progress, and then building, as you said, a bespoke development program for them. So, and it shouldn't be a one size fits all. And I think the mistake that some organizations make is that they say, okay, well, we've put them in the box for succession planning in this area. Let's develop them for that. When that might not be their bailiwick or what they want to do. So uh, the idea of really understanding what the individual wants, where the opportunities are in the organization, where the skills are for these people, where the gaps are, and then looking for opportunities to develop those gaps. And thinking out of the box when you're looking for those development opportunities too. So sometimes it might be a role, different role they work in. Sometimes it might be a training course. Sometimes it might be an external advisory board position or or working on the board of a charity, but doing something that develops those skill sets, or maybe it's mentoring somebody else to do something. So it's there are lots of different ways in which you can develop people. And I think we tend to think, oh, let's just put them in that job; that'll help them get there. But we giving them a mentor who's great at the thing that they're not great at. So or even an executive coach sometimes. But there are lots of ways to develop people. It's kind of ensuring you get the right method, if you like, for that individual and for the skill that they're trying to pick up.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that there's, so I remember at Microsoft, in terms of development, it was like you would take extremely senior, like, partner level, like, engineers in at Microsoft, and they'd be managing, like, college hires, like, just out of college. I remember I was a college hire at Microsoft, and I got this email from another college hire who's kind of like, "Well, I'm gonna redesign this part of Excel, and this is my question, and I'm wondering, like, in this situation, what would you do?" I'm like, "Wow, you've got a college hire, like, designing Excel." Like, that almost felt crazy to me, but then when I realized and I started, leading companies, you can take college hires and you can give them just a tremendous amount of responsibility because they have no fear. Because
Yes.
they don't have any fear because 'cause they've never seen it before. They're like, "Okay, I'll just go do that." It's like, that was what I was asked to do, and they just go, and it's amazing how elastic, people can be, and especially I think career switchers, I think, early career folks, and that's been just, like, super interesting.
Also, I think sometimes they're not bound by the previous thinking in the organization. So, we get, in an organization, we tend to be bound by what we've done before. And so these new people coming in, they don't have any barriers or boundaries that they're thinking about. They can think about things in a fundamentally new way. And similarly, with people coming in from other organizations, they bring fresh thinking and can think outside of that box. So I totally agree with you. But going back to your original comment, I think it's really important that you take the time to step back and look at the individuals and the opportunities because it's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day running of the business and what's urgent today and letting the urgent kind of block out the important. And I would say your people development is incredibly important, but it's not always the most urgent thing on your mind today. So this urgency versus importance is something that good leaders can do. They can split out this thinking about the I've got to get this business or this client today, but how do we make sure we're balancing that with the long term future and health of our organization?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, and it's the biggest unlock when you get someone to go and do something new and they could just have more capability. And I love that concept of succession plan, which is sort of like, okay, How do I delegate a manager or leader? How do I delegate as much as I'm doing today to that next level down? And when you can delegate that and coach that, you have this tremendous unlock on your own time, and that other person can sort of level up. I'm I'm just on this kind of concept of like these non-intuitive, people, these sort of people approaches, right? I'm kind of curious what else is sort of like non-intuitive in organizations, right? They're like, okay, we did this way because we used to. Now this kind of like drop college hires in at the deep end and have them work on like incredibly important projects. Like that's kind of non-intuitive, but it's actually
Hmm.
creates an amazing unlock. This sort of urgency versus importance, like it's non-intuitive because, well, it's not on the time. I don't have to like jam this in right now, but you have such a big unlock in the medium term
Hmm.
and long term. What
Hmm.
are the things that can be sort of non-intuitive in that sort of HR
Yeah,
development talent space?
I think uh, well, I would say not just in the talent space, but when you think about being strategic, and I think of that uh, in lots of ways, and I think of it very much about people and leaders, and how they think about strategy. Being strategic to me is about making those directional choices that get you towards your hoped for future. And this definition was by somebody called Erica Anderson from a book called Being Strategic, and I just love it because it leads to this idea of you're making choices to get to this vision that you have out there in the future. And you know what we tend to think of is making choices is kind of simple, but really it's about not it's choosing what not to do as well as what to do. And I think, people like to throw a lot of things out and say, if we do all of these things, we're going to be successful. And it's very tempting because, the more I do, the better it's going to be. And I think the non-intuitive thing around this is actually it's having the discipline to choose what not to do and where to focus your resources to get to that hoped for outcome. And it requires discipline of thinking um, in order to decide that you're going to cut projects. You're not going to be focusing on this. You're going to truly only put your resources on what's going to get you to that hoped for outcome, that vision that you have for the future. And to me, that's not intuitive. When I was earlier in my career, I always thought the more I did, the better I'm going to be. And I think that's one of those areas where, as you progress in business and as in leadership, um, you recognize that you're always going to have limits on the number of resources that are available to you, time, and opportunities. So, spending those in the most important and impactful way that get you to where you want to go, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, 100%. I love that. I think that, yeah, there's this, people think the more I do, the better everything is, but it's actually what you say no to and you can focus on that like
Yes.
creates the clarity and the high leverage.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would.
When you think about a startup, so you've worked at Fortune 500, you worked at startups. When you think about that journey towards the better systems, like what are the things that you think startups do maybe a little too late or maybe a little too early, like on that journey? It's like, no, in terms of
Mm,
that vision, the sequence and the steps. So like over formalizing, like do you over formalizing performance review or maybe under formalizing recruiting processes? Like
mhm,
are there things that you see and that's like, ooh, this
mhm,
sounded like a good idea at the time, but but what really
mm.
happened was, was this.
Um, I find that with startups, they go through certain phases in their development according to how large they are in terms of people frequently. And when it's 0 to 100 people, it's kind of a free for all. Everybody knows everybody else. You can get things done quickly. There's no need for any structure or bureaucracy. And it's great. It's exciting. Everybody loves being at those companies because it's simple. Um, but once it gets beyond 100 people, it starts to get more complex. And what I see happening in organizations is they do a little bit of what you just said, even Ian, which is they either get um, too bureaucratic too quickly and they want to but more frequently, they don't put in systems and infrastructure soon enough. And it's recognizing when that's important. And there's then a group of people who say, well, this is bureaucratic. We don't want this. Um, But I think the secret is putting in the right amount of infrastructure to be able to make the organization work smoothly and more quickly as it grows without it becoming bureaucratic. And that to me is the secret sauce, if you like, of organizations growing well. Um, Knowing how much structure to put in there and how to sell that to people, because there are people that kind of like things the way they ran before, but demonstrating actually sometimes you have to slow it up a little bit, put in a bit of structure to move more quickly as you go forward. And that to me is what I've seen in pretty much every startup. Because I consult to a few startups and I've worked in a few. And it's the question on a lot of CEOs' minds, which is how much structure is too much structure? I get asked that a lot. And really thinking about when to introduce certain technology systems, people systems and processes. It really has to be thought through about how much you really need for that point in time. And also it requires expenditure for some of these things as well. So putting in technology systems is not inexpensive in terms of dollars or people. And so when's the right time to institute those, for example?
Yeah, 100%. I think one thing that we talked about is sort of competencies, right? So it's like that's a structure, job families. But what we're trying to do at Mattermost, and what we I took this from Microsoft is like, well, there's kind of like levels across the company. What's in a level 4, level 5, level 6, and it just gives
Yeah.
us a cross-functional indication of sort of like seniority and like what combinations of people you can kind of put together and being able to have like different levels of conversation. And what I've been trying to influence is how do we have this sort of cross-functional like levels and saying, okay, this
Mhm.
person can, so in L4, they can work on complex tasks, right? L5 is like they can work on projects involving multiple complex tasks and start influencing cross-functionally. And L6 is like, yeah, you should be really cross-functional and understand how to do this and sort of so on. And you can map those competencies, different job titles, but you need to have like, okay, I'm going to put the people in here, and based on their level, they should be competent at this piece. Um, and I think that's one view that I might have, but I think another view might be like, no, no, for this job family, they can work cross-functional. For this job family, they can't, so they're not sort of interchangeable.
Mm.
I'm kind of curious, like, do you have what have you seen in terms of company-wide levels versus maybe more sort of functional levels? Is there any sort of philosophy or sort of pros and cons? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most important things around leveling in organizations is that there is consistency and a good understanding about what those levels are and what's expected of those levels. And I frequently see organizations putting in a leveling structure, and they've got the nice little boxes that says if you're a VP, you have this scope, etc. Um, uh, but it's really about when you're coming to promote somebody or coming to recruit somebody into a particular level, does everybody really have the same understanding of what that is? And for me, that's one of the hardest things to implement. The setting it up is simple because there are all of these matrices out there. You can download them off the internet. It's the implementation of it that takes, that's more nuanced and is more of a challenge. And so having a senior team that are really aligned around these levels and structures is incredibly important. And you and I were talking the other day about when we hire somebody, um, you know, hiring somebody at a particular level and really understanding what what's expected of that role, and having a few people in an intake meeting to talk about what does this role really look like. This is what it is on paper, but what's our common understanding of how we're going to interview this person to make sure we're getting the right person for that level and for that skill set. Um, and it's through those conversations that you help get this alignment. Um, to your other point, there was functional versus level, if you like, and that can be a bit more challenging. Um, uh, but I would say, you want leaders who can interpret these tables for themselves and say, okay, well, for me, this really looks like this and this skill set. And so I'm going to adapt it a little bit to suit my needs. So it shouldn't be something that's written in stone. It should be it should be a living um, uh, document that is interpreted by leaders in a um, that there's interpreted leaders in a very functional way. And I would say also we have conversations around technologists about can they be, you know, can you be a certain level without managing people, managing a big team? And in some organizations, they say, no, this is what you got to do. And I think that leads to terribly bad behavior. People building their empires in order to get the next level up in the organization. Um, but we had chief architects in some of the organizations that I worked at where they managed nobody, and that wasn't their skill. We tried them managing people. It was not a great success. But they got a very large title, and they were compensated incredibly well because that's what we needed to do for the organization. And so I think interpreting these leveling documents too rigidly can lead to the wrong behaviors. And I think you still have to retain some flexibility around it according to the organization's needs.
Yeah, that's spot on. So one of the things we're figuring out right now at Mattermost is like, okay, we've got this, we're very strong product engineering function historically. It's like, okay, we came from Microsoft. This is how we build product. What we found is
Yeah.
there's sort of, there's a need to go fast, to do sort of like prototypes and to do something very quickly to fix the customer issue and then figure out how to like either leave that as a custom fix or migrate it back into the platform. And those
Hmm.
decisions need to be made. And what we found is like there's some, take that pool of engineers who are wonderful. There's a few people that are really good at building fast. Right. And as you build fast, you kind of give up some of the structure that product engineering is used to,
Hmm.
but you solve the customer problem. So we've created a couple of pods. We created fast futures, right, which is fast prototyping, and deployment engineering, which is kind of like a little bit like professional services, but more sort of like technically rigorous than a typical professional service. And the whole goal is to like, before deployed from product engineering and move things back over time.
Hmm.
And one other version of this structure to say, actually, we should have product engineers have the competencies to be, fast,
Yeah.
right? So build it fast or build it right. And some people like build it fast or build it right just like breaks their brains because they're like, wait, I cannot do anything but build it right. Right. It's like, but
Yeah.
sometimes just build it fast. We're not gonna like this is for one customer, it's one fix, right? Um, so the choices are either, like the ideal is you have that in one sort of engineering organization, right? That has the skill sets at different levels to do fast and do it right.
Yeah.
The challenge is that's going to be changing the definition of the levels. It'll be adding criteria to levels, and suddenly you'll have people who are very mature L6, L7 that are like, wait, I don't know how to build it fast. And suddenly
Mm-hmm.
that's a requirement for me. So how do you think about like changing, like when you change that requirement and change the levels, it changes the culture, it's moving people's cheese. Um,
Yeah.
have you like, but then how else would you transform the organization? So
Hmm.
I don't know. That's something that we're thinking about and working through. I'm just quite curious,
Yeah.
like, is this common, uncommon?
Yeah, well, it's not uncommon because organizations do have to change over time, whether it's through growth, and the organization getting larger, whether it's because the environment's changing, and so you have to change with it. Um, and this idea of, you know, great being the enemy of good sometimes, is a hard one for people because, you know, when people have this kind of wiring of, this is what's made me successful in the past, to kind of try and change that requires people to be um, flexible, and some people have more flexibility than others, and you know, and not everybody is going to be able to change with the organization. And you can give them every opportunity. We talked just about a culture change a few minutes ago. You can pull all of those levers. You can ensure people understand that this is what you're looking for, this is what we're recruiting for, this is what you're being rewarded for, this is what people are being promoted for. Uh, I can give you a coach maybe. I can I can give you all of these support mechanisms to help get you there. But if it's just so much in your DNA that you can't change this, then there probably isn't a role for that person in the future if that's where the company is going. And they doesn't mean they failed. It just means that their skill set is best suited in an organization that values what they have to offer. And I think sometimes we get very caught up in the idea that, well, oh my goodness, they're not able to adapt to what we need right now. That doesn't mean that they failed or you have. It just means there's a better fit somewhere else. And we have to. I think we have to treat people with respect when that happens and help them find something that that suits that skill set. Um, and I think it's keeping people around in an organization where they can't fit into that new culture and way of operating is actually not fair on them or the company. I had a boss who used to say to me, when we tried to string this out, kind of too long, if you like, he used to say, did you ever regret somebody that you didn't ask to leave, say that you should have left it longer? And the answer is no. I think when you've figured out you've done everything you can for that person and they can't make that move, you're better off being honest with them up front. I mean, it's not an easy job, especially if they've served the company very well up to now. But that doesn't mean to say they're going to serve each other well in the future, the company and that individual.
Yeah, 100%. I think it makes a lot of sense. The phrase that we have sometimes is multi-tool player, right? So it's like, okay, as the needs of the company change, if you do one or two things, it's a little tricky. But if you're doing three or four or five things,
Yeah.
it's so easy to move people laterally, and move them around. And I think that there's people who want to be sort of like very deep experts, which is really good if that area is going to be like continuing to have that demand.
Yes.
How do we use engagement surveys to transform? Like at the start, during, in the middle, is it the same engagement survey and we sort of measure as we go? Or is the engagement survey change?
So for engagement surveys, I think they're very useful for taking the temperature of where we are today. And so when you want to uh, effect a change, understanding where people are at the moment in their thinking. Are there pockets of the organization that think different from other pockets? Are there levels that have a particular point of view or resistance? Just understanding, the demographic of the organization with regards to that change is incredibly important because um, in order to affect your change well, you need to perhaps there's a pocket that are already doing this and they are all on board and they think this is great. That's great knowledge because you can use them as examples and showcase them, and recognize them and reward them, uh, in order to help bring other people along. What it can't do is, and I think some people kind of try to lead the witness in engagement surveys and ask leading questions to try and get people to think differently. That doesn't really work. You kind of it's a tool to help you understand where people are today, um, and then you can use the results afterwards and talk about what you found and what people's perspectives are and what your perspectives are and where the organization is going and how you'd like to see this move in the future. But it's definitely a tool for today's temperature and then figuring out what you need to do in order to get everybody to your hoped for outcome. Um, and I think when you've got areas of particular challenge, doing deep dives with focus groups and understanding a little bit more about that challenge because engagement surveys can tell you a yes or no or a gradation. They can't tell you the why, and being able to figure out the why is incredibly important as well. So in a focus group, you can say, well, what's stopping you from doing this? Or, why do you feel that this isn't the right way to go in the future? And by asking the why questions, you can get at the root causes of people's resistance. And when you understand what the resistance is, you're then best positioned to address that resistance. So they're useful tools, and they're good for helping you explore where you need to kind of dig deeper, as it were.
Excellent. And when you think about structure, maybe just go one click down. When you think about structuring an engagement survey, like what are sort of like the principles in terms of like what are great questions? Like how do you think about anonymity or not
Yeah,
anonymous? Like what are sort of like different approaches to make
yeah.
one click down to make a great and effective engagement survey?
Mm. I am a fan of anonymity. Um, the challenge is people don't often think they're anonymous. And, so getting people to the point where, they understand that this isn't gonna be attributed to them, I think is important. Um, Asking questions as I previously mentioned, that don't lead people to a particular answer, because um, they need to be kind of a little bit free of values, if you like, because you're asking it in a negative way, you're going to get a particular response, and so you have to be careful about the way you ask a question. Um, Having them too long or too short, I think, is challenging as well because people get fed up. Asking repetitive questions, not so good. Um, I'm actually a huge fan of having one or two large engagement surveys a year, and then having pulse surveys monthly with just 4 or 5 questions of the things that you really want an update on. Um, and in some organizations I've worked in, even departments would do their own 5 or 6 questions every month on the areas they're trying to improve. So when you do your engagement survey, you have these priorities, and they're usually only 3 or 4 priorities of things that you really want to work on. Um, and so understanding how you're moving the needle in real time, are the strategies that you're employing working or not, is incredibly helpful. Um, you have to be a little bit careful that people don't get survey fatigue, but if you keep them short and you keep them really focused on those areas that you want to find out about, and that are important to the organization and the strategy, then I think it's worthwhile doing short pulse surveys.
Yeah, excellent. I think, one thing because we're a remote company, and because we have a large sort of technical group, right? There's this behavior that some people exhibit and some don't, which is the sort of feeling a sense of accountability as the expert in their area to influence
Mm.
their manager, cross-functional leadership. It's like I'm the expert here. It's my job to go influence, and that can be anywhere from like L6, L7, even down to L4, just individual contributors who just have like they think that they're so close to the information that they should really be influencing everyone. And that's what I believe. That's what I want as a company.
Yeah.
And then there's another group that's basically like very used to command and control. They're really used to like, if my manager doesn't tell me to do it, I shouldn't be doing it. My manager is like much smarter than me. The company is much smarter than me. I hope they make the right decision. And when they make a decision that's counter to what they're seeing on the ground, they're frustrated and upset. So, one question that I'm wondering, and I'm kind of curious,
Yeah.
like, is this over the line? Can I say, you know, scale 1 to 10, do I agree? It's my responsibility as the expert in my area to influence my manager, cross-functional, and leadership, right? Do you agree with that? Um, is that fair or is that influencing?
Um, so you're asking that question in the survey?
Yeah, I think it's one of the ideas. Like we have a very traditional sort of engagement survey. I'm like,
Yes.
okay, I want to add in some things that I think it's leading. It's like I think we want people to be more independent, and we want people to have this value where we like junior people and senior people are on the same playing field, and they're very comfortable in meetings, like sharing their opinion. And we could find different phrasings of that, but that's kind of a value
Yeah.
in a measurement. But I'm
Oh,
yeah.
well, I think it's a great idea. I think the wording of the question is important, though, Ian. So, I feel I have the ability to, voice my opinion and influence people senior to me. And I think when you ask it that way, you're getting at a culture angle in the organization, which is, I have the opportunity to do that. Um, because this comes down frequently to people's managers. You know, are the managers creating an environment where they're asking for those opinions? Are they open to receiving them? Do they take the opinions, say that's great, implement those ideas, and turn them into actions? Um, because it's people may feel that they want to do that, but they might not feel the environment is receptive to it. And so so this is part of really good management, I believe, which is gathering information from people around you who are best positioned to give it to you. They are the experts. Taking that and making sure that those ideas are implemented. Um, but, there may be some people that just don't have those ideas maybe. Uh, but hopefully you've got people who are contributing, and the managers are eliciting that information, and putting it into action. So to me, that's a cultural question. Do I feel I have the ability to influence and get my ideas accepted and implemented?
Yeah, I think that that makes sense. I guess that yes, so 100% with you. That's a much softer way to answer it. I think it's framed in a really in a really excellent way. I guess another question I have is, what's where do I so that's about the environment. I feel I have the opportunity. What's our ability to ask about, the expectations of the individual as opposed to, the environment? So, for example, like,
Mhm,
um, their responsibility to, their responsibility to kinda step up. If you feel that architecture review is going the wrong way, right,
mm,
there's people in the review that are like so the root problem, the question behind the question is, I get engineers who won't say a thing until they're 95% certain. And then I
mm,
have other people that are like 10% and they'll shoot out an idea. And if the engineers that have a lot of depth and confidence aren't speaking up and they say, well, I'm going to disagree and commit, then like that's kind of a thing that happens where we end up making the wrong decisions because maybe the more vocal people uh, speak up more. So you're going to get the survey that's going to be, I feel I have the opportunity. It's all the vocal people,
yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe it's the people who aren't quite as vocal to not speak up. So that's like one sort of real world challenge that we have, and
yeah,
I'm trying to figure out
yeah.
how to get the engagement system. Yeah.
It's an interesting one. You know, it's kind of very intrinsic. Um, extroverts tend to speak out quickly. They tend to talk while they're thinking, um, and it's just their way of operating. And introverts tend to listen, take in a lot of the information, fully form their thoughts before they say something. And that can be challenging if it's a rowdy room because they can then waiting for the moment to be able to get their thought in. And the conversation might have moved on by that stage. And so, I think it's the job of a good facilitator in the room it, to bring that out, and to notice when people have not spoken up, especially when people have got really in-depth knowledge about a topic. Because there are the people who are, you know, the loudest in the room aren't always the most knowledgeable, to your point. Um, so it's hard to get people to change their way of operating because it's a little bit instilled in us. I mean, you can encourage people, but a good facilitator, a good leader of the meeting, anyone who's chairing the meeting, that should be one of their roles. Who's not said anything around the table? Who's the expert at this? What's their perspective? I want to weight that a little more than perhaps some of these other people who've been speaking for a long time. Give them the space in the room to be able to express their opinions. Um, and one thing I would also say when with facilitators in a room when they're getting opinions like this is the person chairing the meeting, who's probably the most senior, should never give their opinions first. Um, it should always be they should always hold their opinion to the end. We had when I worked at Moody's, we had uh, a great kind of leadership uh, way of operating there that was driven by the CEO Ray McDaniel, and he would start with the most junior person in the room and ask their opinion, and then slowly would go around to the most senior person and gather everybody's perspective before he would make a decision on something. And as a result of that, people were not, um, you know, bound by the thinking of those senior people who they think must be right. Um, and so it really a well-chaired meeting should get the opinions of everybody, um, and and the chair should have the ability to understand who's the expert in the room and weight those opinions a little bit more forcefully. Um, but I'm not sure that's I I I'm not sure that's an engagement survey issue necessarily, but a leadership and management issue. Um,
Yeah, 100%. And how do you flow that down? Is it just sort of like learning by example, by bringing people more in the room and leading by and just showing how to do it? Or is it formal training? Is there like a policy manual? Like how far can you sort of flow these down, like in large organizations?
Well, I think it's something that you can teach managers to do. I mean, this is a very teachable skill. Um, it's quite simple actually. Um, but reinforcing it from the top with all your leaders really helps. So whenever there's a decision to be made and you want input, very purposefully, going around the room with, and leaving the most senior person to the end. Um, it helps when people see it. They will emulate leaders that they admire and the way that they do things. So it's very important to have people um, demonstrate that behavior, role model that behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's also kind of it makes a lot of sense in the moment, and then when I think about actually doing it, I'm kinda like, you're gonna light up the most like, you have all these senior people, the most junior piece you're gonna put on the spot, so you gotta maybe pre-coach that person. It's like, "So you know, like, when you come here." Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think the thing is, there should be no wrong answer. you know, and when all ideas are good ones. It's having a culture of openness and of being receptive to all ideas and thinking, because that really gets you, you know, the most innovation in your organization. And isn't that what we're looking for? We want the ideas, but we might miss out on an idea from somebody who's fairly junior if somebody senior says something first and they're like, "Oh, no, I'm not saying that. It's gonna make me sound really stupid." Um, and the idea of getting some new thinking, and you talked earlier, Ian, about, isn't it great that you get these graduates coming in who are not bound by existing thinking, coming up with ideas, and they don't have that fear. So this, in a way, is doing exactly what you talked about earlier, which is getting all the benefit of all of that fresh thinking, and rolling it up, so that the person who's finally going to make the decision is has the benefit of all of those different ideas.
That's super interesting. Actually, it's all these, like, when I was out of college at Microsoft, and just remember myself,
Yeah.
I can't remember, like, I was in these meetings with all these senior people, and I didn't quite know why, and then, like, people would light me up and ask, like, "What do you think about this? What do you think about that?" I totally remember this. It's all kind of flashback, so now it's all sort of making sense now. That's really cool. Yeah, I think that, that sort of being in the room and having those opinions is super important. I'm kinda curious, just as we think about this, when there's an important decision to be made, right? Very often, like, I'll be brought in or other senior leaders,
Mhm.
and there's this concept of like, well, if this is the problem, then what I'm looking for is to think about like what are like how do we think of the solutions, right? So if it's a hard problem, right? If it's an easy problem, someone else will make that decision,
Yeah.
right? If it's a hard problem, it'll go to the leadership. And when it's a hard problem, I think that we need to be kind of like broad in our thinking. Like, what are the different possible solutions? What are
Yes.
the ways we could approach this? And then we got to come back and we have to make a decision. And what I found is like some executives, because we're very broad, we're cross functional, we see a lot of things, we can go broad very quickly. And I think people
Mhm.
in the room that are maybe more functional experts, they can't go broad quite as quickly, and there's like this
Yeah.
discomfort. So, how do we think about making these really important decisions culturally,
Mm.
about going broad, but and coming to a conclusion versus I think some people would prefer just like step by step to an answer, which it just if there was step by step to an answer, we wouldn't be having the meeting.
Mm.
So I'm just kind of curious, like, have you seen that before? What does that look like?
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of research been done about the optimum number of people in a room to make a decision, and it's around six or seven people. If you get many more people in the room than that, to your point, you can actually get a little bit overloaded by opinions, and it's hard to kind of bring it back in. Now, it doesn't mean to say you shouldn't ever do that, because there might be occasions when you should, but it's optimal to have around six or seven people. If you're going to have more, and not everybody has got um, the breadth of knowledge to think about this in a holistic way, the functional leaders might want to get from them. So what is it about your area that's really important when we make this decision?
Mm.
So they may not know, yeah, that the CFO may not know the whole challenge, but he can say, look, financially, here are the pros and cons of some of these ideas. Um, from a people perspective, we've got challenges in getting that type of talent if we're going to go in that area and in that way. We're going to have to think differently about the way we do things, or whatever it might be, um, so that they have input into the conversation. They may not have the idea for the whole solution, but they may say, well, with these options that you're considering, there are, you know, there are there are ones that are better or less good in terms of being able to implement it through my function. Um, and that's helpful because yeah, there's a you might have two or three solutions, and you're looking at the pros and cons of each in order to decide which is going to be the one that's most effective or efficient. Um, and so, if your ideation process is good, you get all your ideas. You don't just have idea action, which a lot of startups do. You list your ideas, and only when you finish your ideation do you then go through what's the pros and cons of each. Um, and then you figure out how am I going to overcome those, and then you make your decision as a result. And they may not be best at the ideation phase, but they might be great at what are the pros and cons of these, three top solutions that we came up with, in order to evaluate the one that we're going to choose to implement.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, because there's an ideation phase, and then so you separate the ideation phase from the pros and cons phase.
Yes.
That's a little different than how we've been running it, or how I've been trying to run it, which is like we do, like in a poker analogy, there's an ante and a raise. So it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to put something
Yeah.
here. It's not perfect. Can you do better? And we're trying to combine them at once, but maybe that trades off like efficiency with like breadth.
As long as I mean, one of the challenges we always used to find with startups is they move very quickly, and it's the cost of pivoting is not high. So you can have an idea and try it out because you're nimble. But as you get larger, as the organization gets larger, the cost of pivoting gets higher, and it gets more difficult to do. And so when you make a decision, you've perhaps got to be a little bit more careful about it as you grow. And therefore, having having an ideation session, where you look at all the possible solutions, and there's no bad idea, um, means that you might end up with a more complete set of thinking before you start to knock things off. Oh, you know what? This is great, but it's really not practical. Um, and this one, is not really going to solve the problem as effectively as these other three. So let's focus on these other three. What are the? So you might miss out on saying is you might miss out on an idea if you run with one and then try and get a better one. Um, I don't know.
Yeah,
So
that Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had this feedback from our board a little earlier ago, and it was, we're that startup culture versus sort of bigger company culture is that line. So as you on one hand, you're sort of maturing, right? You have to be more strategic. You're not throwing things at the wall quite as much. At the same time, you do want to go fast and run experiments. And even if you look at like the best tech companies, right? The big tech folks that move surprisingly fast, right?
yeah.
For their scale. And then you've got sort of like, Fortune 500 companies that maybe don't move as fast, maybe in other industries. The feedback to the board is like, essentially, you're a startup, you have to act like a startup and not sort of cosplay a big company. It's like, we're going to cosplay
True.
a public company. Well, in a public company, we would do this. Ho- So how do you think about balancing those two, which is you're not a startup, but you're also not a public company. You want to be fast and agile and
Yeah.
strategic. And how do you set that sweet spot?
Well, even large organizations have their little startup pods, because it is necessary. You need to kind of keep that nimble thinking, and those ideas. And um, so I think that as long as you can keep um, that fast thinking and fast implementing, it's great. What I was talking about in my previous comment was the cost of making a mistake gets higher the bigger your bet.
Yes.
And so, um, it's the size of the bet that you're making, really, that really limits perhaps how fast you move. And so if you can make your bet small, um, in a uh, uh, so that you test something out quickly and then scale it. People do that, or organizations do that, no matter how large or small the organizations are. So it's really about um, how big is it? How big is it going to be? How difficult is it going to be to unwind something, or how costly will it be to unwind if you don't get it right? So it's about start small, test, and then scale. Um, so I think that can happen in large and small organizations, and being nimble and making quick decisions, quick and good decisions, is really important. Um, and you can do both. You can make quick and good decisions if you have the right processes in place.
Yep, excellent. And maybe I think we're thank you so much for just thank you so much. Or just maybe a couple last questions,
Yeah, sure.
because I think these are really important. Those decisions that to be made on the hardest things. You can do quick decisions when it's small, low stakes. There's bigger stakes decisions, and we kind of talked about the 6 or 7 people in a room that make it that are the most important.
Yeah.
And, to make those hard decisions, how do you balance that versus, everyone wants sort of transparency and, to be involved, to have a seat at the table, and if you don't have, like, 40 people in the room, like, people like, "Oh, I got rubbed the wrong way." It's like, why is it 6, 7? Is that like, what's going on with those people? Like, is this a cabal? Like, is what's going like, it's what happened? How do you balance those 2 things? You need that sort of, like, focus and concentration, but then people feeling sort of left out of the process.
Well, it doesn't have to be kind of one process. The 6 people in the room can have gathered information from a large group of people and can represent their perspectives. But if you have that 40 people in the room and everybody feeling that they have the right to chime in, um, it gets to be chaotic. So it's when you it's about gathering the data and the perspectives before you get in the room, because hopefully with really difficult decisions, you're going to have data to back up your perspectives. It's making sure you've gathered all of that. You've taken into account other people's perspectives. You've got all of that information, um, so that when you're in the room, you're not you should only need those 5 or 6 people. You shouldn't need the rest of them at that stage.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to close on. Like, how do you build a culture? How do you sort of shape it with the different processes, and how do you make some of the most important strategic decisions? Melly, thank you so much. This is really great to have you. If people want to find you on the web, like where can we find you on socials or website?
Um, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a website, melanie-hughes.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melody. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, Ian.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.